Amazing. In the beginning, we have a tree and a garden that are alive, and they cause death. In the end, we've got a dead tree, the cross, and a dead garden, a garden tomb, and comes life. It says, God planted, set stationed cherubim at the garden to guard the way to the tree of life with a flaming sword turning in every direction. The cherubim, the sign of the separation on that day was the cherubim. So what is that? That means that the cherubim are the sign of the separation between us and God, us and the garden, and the separation of God and his garden, the world. It's a barrier, a barrier. Now fast forward to the tabernacle, which becomes the temple. What do you see? It was the tent of meeting where God and man are to meet together. What do you see in the temple or the tabernacle? You see the Holy of Holies, the place where God dwells. That represents God's throne, God's heaven, God's place, kind of like Eden. God was there. And interesting, because in the temple of Jerusalem, there were objects, some of those holy objects, it says, make them as buds, blossoms, like something that grows in the garden. And it even says there are images of trees, palm trees in the temple, as in a garden. But then, so there's God, it's a symbol of God, and then there's the veil that says the way is blocked. There's a barrier between us and God. It's a veil. But what is on the veil? It wasn't just a veil. It was a veil with images of the cherubim, the ones who blocked the garden. So here in the temple, you've got God, you got man, and you got the cherubim, just like you did. It goes back to Eden. Goes all the way back to Eden. And so cherubim are blocking everything, the gardener and the garden, man and God. But if there's ever to be life again, it's like the blocking of the blessing. If there's ever to be life again, the gardener has to come back into his garden. God has to return to the world so that man can return to paradise and God. But how does anybody get through this? Because you have the cherubim, and the cherubim have a flaming sword. So you can take it two ways. One is you can't get back, or two, the only way you can get back is through death. Think about that. God himself, to get back to us, to reconcile, to bring peace, to open the barrier, to do all that, to get back to us, he's got to go through death. He's got to pass through the cherubim. And what that means is because there's sin and there's death, so he's got to take that sin, he's got to take that judgment, and that's the only way he can pass through. Even God has to die. The gardener can only come back to the garden through the cherubim. And what's our salvation? Our salvation is God, said, yes, I'm coming back. I'm coming back to the garden. I'm coming back to the world. So God comes back into the world. But the full coming back, the full reconciliation can only come if he goes through the cherubim. So that's why he's on the cross. When he's on the cross, he's passing through death to get back. He's passing through death to get us back and him to us. And so he's got to pass through. And that's why, think about it. What did he say that day? When he's on the cross, he said, I tell you this day, you will be with me in paradise. What does paradise mean? It means a garden of trees. Now, of course, it's heaven, but it's that as well. So when he was on the cross dying, think about it. What happened in the temple? In the temple, the veil of the holy place was torn apart. But what's on the veil? The cherubim are on the veil. So what happened is the cherubim were pushed out of the way because God was passing through. The gardener was coming back into his garden. God, that there be nothing. He's breaking every barrier so there be no barrier anymore between you and him. That nothing could separate you from God anymore because the very life of God passed through it. The gardener is coming back into the garden. Now think about it. The gardener, Adam, had to leave the garden because of sin. Messiah has to end sin in order to re-enter the garden. So he said, it is finished. Now think about this. How cool God is. The first gardener left the garden because of a tree. The second gardener, Messiah, enters the garden through a tree, the cross. Think about that. Man left the garden because of a living tree. Messiah re-enters the garden because of a dead tree, a cross. It says in John 19:41, now in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden. See, it all begins in the garden, and then so redemption has to take place in a garden too. A garden tomb. See, in Eden, you have a garden of life. In salvation, you got a garden of death. You got a garden tomb. From a garden of life, we die. From a garden of death, the tomb, we come alive. We actually get born again. Amazing. In the beginning, we have a tree and a garden that are alive, and they cause death. In the end, we've got a dead tree, the cross, and a dead garden, a garden tomb, and comes life. It says in Genesis 2, verse 8, and the Lord God planted the garden in Eden. He prepared a garden so he's preparing a garden of life to bless man. It says in the Gospel of John, in the place where he's crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden was a tomb. So think about that. God prepared a garden of life and blessing for us, for man. With Jesus, God prepared a garden of death, a tomb. He gave us life, we gave him death. He gave us a tree of life, we gave him a tree of death. But now, even in that, God is going to redeem us and bring life again. So it says in John 19:42, therefore, on account of the Jewish day of preparation, because the tomb was nearby, they laid Yeshua, Jesus, in it. So they laid him in the tomb, a garden tomb. So they're putting him in a garden tomb. It says in Genesis, God put man in a garden. And the Hebrew word, yanach, means he cast him down in the garden. Probably he was asleep, laid him down in the garden, left him alone. And so man takes God and lays him down in the garden tomb. And who is he? He's the gardener. Jesus is the gardener. And so what does it mean? Through death, they put him in the garden tomb. So the gardener is coming back into the garden. It's a garden tomb first, but he comes back into it. Now, we come to that Sunday morning. 2,000 years ago, on Friday night, the world came to an end for the disciples. It was all over. The one they loved, they trusted, had been arrested, mocked, bled to death, killed, and taken into the tomb. It was all over. Then came the Sabbath. They had to rest. You have to rest on the Sabbath. The work is done. You rest until it's over. But the next morning, soon as the Sabbath's over, the disciple Miriam, Mary of Magdala, Mary Magdalene, she comes to the tomb, and it says this, but Mary was standing outside the tomb weeping, and as she wept, she stooped to look in the tomb, and she saw two angels in white sitting, one at the head, one at the feet, where the body of Yeshua, Jesus, had been lying. And they said to her, woman, why are you weeping? She said to them, because they've taken away my Lord. I don't know where they put him. When she had said this, she turns around and she sees Jesus, Yeshua, standing there. And she didn't know it was him. And he says to her, woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking? Then listen, she supposed that he was the gardener. The gardener. He is the gardener. He's the gardener of creation. And he appears, when he comes back, he appears as the gardener. Why? Because he was separated from the garden. Now the gardener appears back at the garden tomb.